CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. After 2 years and more than 80 episodes of our Conversations on African Philanthropy, we are introducing a series of conversations that are theme-specific, program-focused, and at times recorded at the request of those at the coalface of implementation in order to document and tell their experiences and stories. In the first of such series, we focus on the Zimbabwe Alliance Initiative, whose grants, convenings, capacity building, and technical support have fostered a vibrant civil society, where partners were empowered to design innovative and coordinated responses that amplify the voices of those marginalized, influence the capacity of citizens to mobilize around national critical issues, engage with policymakers, and built regional and international solidarity in pursuit of a better Zimbabwe. Formed in 2010 to strengthen the role of civil society in influencing Zimbabwe's transition to democracy, the Alliance has evolved over several phases to what it is today. An initiative of several partners, Zimbabwe Alliance is a story of resilience, innovation, dedication, and passion expressed somewhat beautifully in some of the least expected places and ways.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy and Social Investment with me, Prof Moyo. I'm very excited today to be in Harare, to be joined by Dumisani Nyoni, who is the Senior Advisor, Strategy and Business Development for a very, very important organization, the Organization of Rural Associations for Progress, which I think popularly across the globe is known as ORAP. Dumi, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited personally because for a long time, I've been studying philanthropy and writing about philanthropy. And ORAP has been one of the organizations that globally we've been making reference to in terms of whether you're thinking of community foundations and how they came about, or you're thinking about philosophies around sustainability, self-sustenance. ORAP is always the reference point because of the philosophy of Zenzele, among others. And also how it came about in the 1980s, where you actually looked at villages, did a study, and out of that decided that the communities themselves would actually take charge of the initial funding of the organization. So I would really want us to delve deeper into the work of ORAP, but where possibly also go back to its initial stages in the 1980s. So you were set up in 1980, but only registered formally in 1981.
Correct.
So that means you've been around for more than 40 years. That's a long history. So thank you for joining us.
No, my pleasure.
So maybe we can start by talking about the initial beginnings of ORAP. Who was behind it? What were the main objectives then? And what was the context? Because over 40 years, a lot has changed.
Right. Yeah. So I think ORAP, more than anything, is a response. Right. ORAP is a response. You can say impendulo.
Yeah.
But a response to what? What is the question?
Right.
And the question was, how do people in Africa, post-colonially, advance their lives? How do they take charge of their development trajectory? How do they mobilize themselves to respond to the question of their livelihood, but rooted in who they are? I think the historical context of Africa, whether it's Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, anyway, is part of what colonialism did was it stripped people of their identity, it stripped people of their tradition, their practice. Here I'm sitting with you doing an interview in English.
Yeah.
Right?
Whereas we should be doing it in Ndebele.
Right. So and the response was, okay, how do people respond to the question of development, but rooted in their identity and their origins and their traditions and their history?
Yeah. So
the story of ORAP actually was born out of an inquiry around that. So one of the founders of ORAP, Dr. Dumisani Nyoni, in the 70s, was a teacher at a school called Mzinyatini.
Yeah.
Mzinyatini school is in Eskodini, in Matebele in South. And as a young teacher, she was asked to teach girls what they used to call domestic science back then.
Yeah.
But effectively, these girls were being taught how to be maids in the cities for a mainly white colonial community. And she was tasked with teaching these girls how to do lasagna, and make jam tarts and tea. And that was a foreign idea for rural women. So she then said, no, I have to teach these girls how to do domestic science in what is domestic to them as domestic scientists. So she created a fire outside and taught them how to cook umfushwa, how to cook amanqina, ischwala, uphoro, inyaoti. And there was a tension now, because the school said, that's not in the curriculum. I said, but why am I teaching these young girls something that's outside of their cultural context? And long story short, she was fired for doing that. But then that led the question of, so how do we do this? Who are we as a people? And I think that was the genesis of this passion around how do we connect ourselves as Africans to practices and beliefs and responses to development that are rooted in a context that we can identify with. So when ORAP was founded after independence, the question was, well, what do we do as a people, right? The country is now called Zimbabwe, but we have communities that have been destroyed, not only by a war, but destroyed by a systemic approach to depersonalizing and deculturalizing ourselves. And so ORAP started off as a dialogic process, people coming together to have a conversation that says, who are we, what are we, how do we move forward? And in Ndebele we call that to examine yourself, to do a personal inquiry. So what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And who is going to come and sort out these problems that we've identified for us? No one. So we have to do it for ourselves. And that's where the philosophy of Zenzele came out of. So more than an organization, more than a corporate structure, ORAP is really a philosophy and a movement of people seeking self-determination and seeking to reconstruct their context based on what they know, with the help of others from everywhere else, but in its essence, it's about in and out, not out and then in. It's in and then out. So that's really the context of where ORAP was born from. And before the name ORAP existed, it was about how do we organize ourselves in the rural context that we know, which I think we call Ilima. So how do we organize ourselves in these groupings, which became associations for progress? So the organization of rural associations for progress.
I mean, it's been 45 years or so since ORAP was developed and put in place. But before I get to what I want to talk about, which is the successes that you have seen over the years, I read somewhere that you conducted a study in the beginning, and that study also did some computation around how much each household would contribute, and out of that study, it was actually clear that communities themselves could actually, in a way, sustain and finance their interventions. If I remember very well, at that time it was $1 per household. Maybe I don't know if we can go back there and talk a bit about that. I mean, it's been so many years ago, but that study itself.
But I think the beyond the monetary value, the idea is to self-reflect and recognize that we don't come from nothing. Everyone has value, right? And money is a representation of value. Money isn't value; it's a representation of value. So if we sit together, and say, what can we put collectively together to lift each other up? That's really where philanthropy comes from. Philanthropy comes from someone saying, I have more than I recognize. And with that excess, I can build something with others. I can build something with other people. And so, but when you've been told over and over and over that you have nothing and you need me to give you something, it destroys you. So the founding idea of ORAP was to self-examine and to self-reflect and then to recognize what that little chicken I have, or that cow, or that brick, or this field, is something, it's a starting point. Akuna muntu angasumuntu olutho. Everyone has
something to offer.
Yeah. And so once people can recognize that at an individual level and then at a collective level, that's why we're saying zihluze, zikoqe, organize yourself as a community, right? Once you then you're more than one. So my $1, your $1, and the more we put those dollars together, now you have an endowment. We are an endowment as a community. We are an endowment as a people. How do we build on that? That was the lesson from that study and from that assessment.
I'm enjoying this conversation because, you see, because I sit at a place now where I research this, I teach it, but I also get to be invited by different institutions to talk to them about this. So recently I was in New York, and there were groups of fellows who are attending the City University of New York, where they are studying community philanthropy and stuff. And then there are others who come from Chile, from Brazil, and others. And one of their fascinations is how to build a community foundation using own resources. So this is already a model that is there, but it stretches back to the 1980s or so. But the Foundation for Community Development in Mozambique, Mrs. Marshall's foundation, when they set it up, they also used the same philosophy. They looked at themselves and said, before we go out to ask for additional funding, what do we as a community have? So they pulled resources together, mainly women who actually did that, led by Mrs. Marshall. You go to Rwanda right now, the concept of doing it for yourself is actually manifested in some of what they call their local initiatives. One of them is, making sure that, every last Saturday of the week, people get together, they clean, they contribute what they have. But, in 1975, the OAU actually had a framework and resolution. It's called the Monrovia Declaration.
From Liberia.
And that declaration was talking about self-reliance, self-sustenance, and so forth and so on. So what am I saying? I'm simply saying that there's a reference point here with what ORAP did in the 80s, and that remains relevant even today. Have there been moments in the different strategy developments and reviews where you have actually looked back and doubted this philosophy of Zenzele?
No, I don't think Zenzele has ever been in doubt, because if you doubt Zenzele, you doubt yourself.
Your own dignity.
I don't think there's ever been a contestation around what the significance of Zenzele means. But what you're saying about Monrovia, what you're saying about Mozambique, Rwanda, is true, because it's a very human dynamic to want to come together, contribute, and move forward. If you look at whether you're a communist or a capitalist, whatever is, fundamentally, capital is about a collective, right? And some people might get offended because collectivism is identified with communism and capitalism. But capital is about a collective, right? When someone says we are a fund, whether you're in New York or where you have been, that fund is a collective of people's savings. If someone says we're a sovereign wealth fund, we are an investment fund, it's all about collectivity. And so there's nothing new and dramatic about the work of Dr. Marshall or Dr. Nyoni, ORAP, community foundations around Africa, because it's about tapping into that history, right, which we forget. And it's easy to forget as Africans, because we're now fragmented, we're now all over the place because of a very small part of our history, which is the last 200 years. So there's nothing radical about remembering how to come together to pull our ideas, our resources, our labor, our money, our assets for a collective leap forward. So I don't think there's ever been any self-doubt. But with the way the world has evolved, there have been stresses on the idea. Because if you look at the 80s, the world was ideologically divided. If you look at the 90s, economies around the world were under stress to go the capitalism route.
The IMF and others.
Right. And so in that experience, what does that mean for development? Is development about me and my personal balance sheet and my personal capital at household level, my individual pursuit versus the collective and the community. Towards the end of the 90s, into the first decade of the 2000s, HIV ravaged communities in a way where the nature of communities changed. So in all of those processes, you ask deep questions about how do we survive as a people. But the answers always lay in community, right? Whatever the question in those period was, the answer was in community. How do you respond to HIV? Community is the answer. How do you respond to drought? Community is the answer. How do you respond to migration? Community is the answer. How do you respond to other shocks and stresses that have then come? Community is the answer. And so in community are individuals, and in the individual is Zenzele. So I don't think there's been a faltering in the belief of the power of Zenzele.
But even if we were to look at it from the political economy of the world and even of the different countries now, the solutions to solve countries' problems now is back to communities. It's back to communities, but also to domestic resources. I mean, if you look at the decrease right now on overseas development assistance, among others, is back to communities and looking away from the other global partners that used to support countries, and governments are now looking inwards, and that's really taking us back again to the individual, to the community. So just to emphasize the importance of that philosophy, that it has withstood the time, and is still going to be one reference point going forward. I was looking at some of the successes, and I think part of the advantage with you is that you've been concentrated in 4 regions for quite some time, and that allows you to really see the difference and the impact that you have made in 40 years. And I was seeing crazy numbers around the amount of people who are reached, whether it's children at school, women, and etc. Can we maybe highlight some of the major milestones and successes that ORAP has kind of attained over the last 40 years? I know it's a long history, and in every context, as you were saying, the 80s, the 90s would probably have their own success. But are there any major milestones that you want to highlight?
Well, I think one of the things we don't do well in Africa is sing our songs. Right. And also document them and create milestones, as you're saying. So it's hard to think of the work we are doing in terms of success, because success is community is still going. I think the greatest success is community is still going. But in the 80s and the 90s, food security was a very, very big challenge. And what ORAP really succeeded in doing in the western region of Zimbabwe, where we predominantly work, was in mobilizing people to deal with food insecurity, with hunger. Right? Because at the end of the day, that is worldwide, food security is the most fundamental thing about a community. And that response, which was community-driven, community-based, was based on community mobilization. It wasn't based on relief efforts only and redistributing grain from overseas. I think that's why in 93, ORAP was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, because it had really managed to have people take charge of responding to food insecurity. I think subsequently, ORAP has then managed to create systems for not only households' food security, but dealing with issues of healthcare at the household level, and dealing with HIV was a big issue in the 90s and into the 2000s. Having people look at their arts and their culture as not just entertainment, but a key component of human and identity and cultural development. I think ORAP managed to look at education and skills development and training as something that is located in community. Whereas traditionally people leave their communities to go and get trained in a metropole. In the ORAP context, development centers were established in the community. So if you go to Cholocho, there's a development center. If you go to Mzingwane, there's a development center. You go to Ububi, you go to Gweluchena Enkai, you go to Lupani. Those centers were built by the communities to create a location where youth
Yeah.
and community could come to either discuss their problems or develop their skills. And those centers are still standing. You can go and see them, and there's activity happening there. In the early 2000s, there was another massive drought, and ORAP again was very involved in mobilizing people in dealing with that food insecurity. But on a systemic level, what ORAP has done, especially over the last 15 years, is to return to that root of a community model that is known as amalima. How do people organize themselves in Ilima, at a village level, to work together to solve problems systemically and through community assessment and community reflection. And the Amalima work we've done with partners like USAID and other partners as well has helped communities to really remain sturdy in fighting development challenges. Not just one thing, like today people like to focus on issues. Let's deal with climate change, let's deal with domestic violence, let's deal with child nutrition, as if those things are not part of a human development system. I think through mobilizing people in Amalima, ORAP has helped to root what really is indigenous social capital on a sustainable basis. So I can't say, like you would say in other spaces, I can't say we won the World Cup in this year, we won the World Champions League in that year in terms of milestones, but the achievement is sustained human progression, sustained human development, which is hard to tell in terms of milestones and targets.
But like you said, I mean, the greatest achievement and milestone is that the communities are there, they're intact, they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. But you see, the thing is, the world is organized in very interesting ways. You and I are speaking in this language now, but you know, I can easily take what you've been saying and frame it in the current language of Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
They tell you that since 1981, you've been working on goal number 1.
Right.
You know, reducing poverty.
Correct.
We've been working on goal number 2, which is on hunger. We've been working on goals on education, etc., etc. Now you can even include climate change, because that's the way that you're working on. That's one. And then the philosophy around the SDGs, leave no one behind. That's exactly what you are saying and doing. So if you use the concept of Amalima, why do we do Amalima? It's because we realize that maybe in a community, some people don't have the tools of trade, and therefore you pull your resources, and in just one day or a couple of hours, you have cleared the farm. So no one is left behind. That's the language of SDGs. But
and in some cases, I might have the tools, but not the knowledge. So you will have the knowledge. That's part of the process. Right. My livestock are dying. I might have 20 cows, but you know, if you go to this part of the forest, this tree, you process it this way, you've solved your problem. The knowledge and the asset come together.
And so in the philanthropy space where we operate ourselves and we teach now at the business school, we use examples like Amalima to demonstrate the horizontal forms of philanthropy, which is community philanthropy or philanthropy for communities, where communities realize their own assets and also realize that in order to develop, this is what they're supposed to do. And that also demonstrates forms of solidarity and reciprocity. So that on its own, I mean, if you look at it without context, we might just think of it as Amalima. But we are promoting that as a biggest form of a version of philanthropy that you find in Africa. You may rarely find something like this in some of the countries that are individualistic, simply because of the philosophy that is behind them. But in Africa, everything, like you said, you have to think of the community, and that Amalima, burial societies, you know, all forms of associations that you are working with get to be conceptualized as forms of philanthropy. So you may not frame it like that, but sitting where I sit, I can easily use that. That's why I said in the beginning, ORAP has always been a reference point for me, who has been studying philanthropy for many, many years. And I always use it as an example of an indigenous form of philanthropy. And of course, you went on to establish the foundation, which I would want us to talk to at some point. But to me, obviously in the 40-something years, there have been some pivots in the way in which either you worked as an institution, in the way in which maybe you related to communities, or how communities related to you. What have been some of the pivots, either in your strategy or in the general approach of the organization? Because 40 years or 45 years is a long period of time.
Yeah, I think a couple of things come to mind. I think the first one is when you're outside of Africa and you are studying about Africa. One of the key criticisms Africa has is we're told we don't have strong institutions. Right? What does that mean? You don't have strong institutions. Are the courts an institution? That's African. Is a parliament an institution? Is a reserve bank or a central bank an institution? So when people talk about those institutions, they talk about institutions that are kind of copying and pasting a model from elsewhere.
From the West mainly.
So in terms of a pivot, I think people in ORAP realized, how do we make ORAP an institution for us as indigenous people? So I think institutionalizing ORAP was probably one of the biggest pivots. Because you're going to have a movement. What is the institution? And how does that institution, on your behalf and with your involvement, interface with other players, whether it's the government of your country, your local government, or philanthropic partners from elsewhere. So I think the biggest pivot was in saying, how do we institutionalize this project, and how do we institutionalize it in a way where it self-sustains, continues to have an engagement with people. So on a regular basis, ORAP members gather and they meet and they debate and they discuss and they mold a pathway going forward. Other than that, everything else is seasonal. After HIV, climate. In 20 years, who knows what will be the season of global discourse around development. But having people say we have an institution that we relate to, I think is dynamic and is transformational. And not many, and I think Africa needs more of these institutions. You can call them community foundations, you can call them local NGOs, whatever you have to call them, but institutionalizing ourselves as communities to have spaces for dialogue and action is by far the most pivotal and transformative action we can take collectively.
So that takes me to maybe talking a bit about some of your strategic thrusts, and one of them in your current strategy, which I think comes to an end, is it 2025 or so, is organizational development. So maybe we can talk about that. What are the issues that you are focusing on? I know that usually when you say OD, we're looking at an internal pillar, but it could also have external ramifications. But also the importance of that, because as you were already talking about that pivot, it lends us into that organizational development pillar of your strategy.
And I think constantly saying, how do we build something that continues to be relevant to communities and continues to involve communities and continues to reflect the aspirations of a community. It's very easy to move away from that and to begin to say, this is what the market wants, right? And everything has a market. So what are the leading donors wanting us to do? How do we raise more money? And how do we make our budgets bigger? And you start focusing on that. And you forget the context and the community. So the balance that ORAP's organizational development is trying to constantly pursue is, how do we resource both the organization and the community context? And which is it's almost contradictory, because people usually set up an organization to respond to an issue, and then you almost end up, when you've been in the development space for a long time, you almost end up existing to deal with fundraising and budget, etc. Disconnected from the purpose. So our pursuit as ORAP is to constantly say, as we develop as an organization, how do we also develop as a development practitioner, as an actor, and not just the objectives of the organization itself. And how we try and do that is on a regular basis. The staff of ORAP, the people who work in the organization, and the communities engage in a joint dialogue by design, intentionally. So you can't disconnect those two. The governance of the organization, even the employees of the organization, reflect that symbiosis. So to avoid having us working on behalf of them,
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
us philanthropists, them beneficiaries.
Yeah.
That dichotomy is dangerous.
Right.
And I think that's killed many a
Yeah.
community in
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
Because who is to say I am not a beneficiary?
Yeah.
Who is the beneficiary?
Yeah.
Who benefits?
Yeah.
Who is to say they are not
Right.
leaders?
Yeah.
They are not visionaries.
Yeah.
So we practice something with communities where we do what we call community visioning.
Yeah.
So what is our vision as a community? Where do we want to go?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we try to avoid using language like we are going to implement for who way, right?
And how?
Right, right. We're an implementing partner to what? So we're intentional about the language we use, right? But then, how do you make that an organizational culture? So that it's not pretentious. It's not. You don't walk into an office and it says our values, our mission. It's just the way we do things.
Right.
So when we talk about organizational development, it's about trying to create that and embed it into the work that we do, such that at its highest level, you can't tell the difference between the person who is in the community that we work and the person who's working in that community. We're doing it together.
Which is very important because, as you were saying, most studies actually show us that with lots and lots of funding, especially international funding, a lot of groups that were community-based were demobilized, and a big fragmentation ends up being created between the institution, which now has to answer to its development partners most of the times, and not have anything to do with the community. So staying engaged with the community is something that is very, very important in development. But that also takes us to your community mobilization strategic pillar. Again, what do we do there?
Well, I mean, communities mobilize themselves according to their own interest and their own incentivization. So you try not to see community mobilization as an outward in thing. It's got to be inside out. So abaqoqi are people from the community who engage and encourage others to come together. Every community, even at household level, is someone who just has a skill in bringing people to a convener. You know. So we can't say ORAP goes around mobilizing communities. ORAP facilitates communities in their mobilization of themselves. And that's the greatest act of philanthropy, actually, for this big of philanthropy. Me leaving my house to come to your house to invite you to discuss a common problem. That's really the essence. And you used a word before where you said solidarity, right? I think solidarity is more appropriate than philanthropy, because philanthropy has almost been redefined to mean me who has more giving to you who has less, right? And so I'm a philanthropist. I own a company. It is a software company. I have $1 billion. I set up a pot to give. So now I'm a philanthropist. No. Philanthropy is me leaving my house to come to your house to say, do we agree that we have a common problem? And then you leaving your house to come to my house to say, I've thought about that issue. Let's do this together. That's the ultimate philanthropy. And so in that philanthropy, inherent is we're mobilizing each other. Right? So community mobilization, I think, is the highest form of philanthropy because it involves me giving of my life, my time to come to you to invite each other to a better potential, a better future. And so we don't disconnect these things where ORAP goes to meet philanthropists. The philanthropists are in
the community.
In fact,
everyone is a philanthropist.
Everyone is a philanthropist.
There are several writings also, because over time Africans have also been reflecting on this. And so, everyone is a philanthropist. Before birth, at birth, when you are alive, when you die. So everyone, like you are saying, is a philanthropist. And this notion that because somebody has got more, they are the philanthropists and others are not, is actually something that we are also trying to dispute. In fact, if you look at it in terms of ratios, the people who have what we call the high net worth individuals and the people on the streets, in terms of ratios and percentages of what they give in relation to what they own, the general person on the street actually gives more than the person who has got more.
Absolutely,
when it comes to ratios and percentages. So I really agree with you.
Well, but if I have 24 hours and you have 24 hours, we have that space.
Yeah.
Yimpilo manje.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ule 24 and 24.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that 24, you might have $100 and I might have $1.
Yeah.
But if I give 1 hour of my 24,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the real philanthropy. Count how many hours people have spent meeting in community to solve problems, to discuss them, to share ideas, to build stuff together. Quantify that in terms of who's the real philanthropist.
So to me, let me ask you, because you are working on these issues and you are articulating them very well. Why do we allow this among ourselves as Africans to then believe that philanthropy is only your Bill Gates, your people that have got money?
It's language.
Yeah.
So let's do away with the word.
Throw away the word philanthropy.
Let's do away with it. That's why I said when you spoke about philanthropy, you then in your next sentence you said solidarity. Right. What is that? In our whatever language you want to use in Africa. Right. Ukubambana, ukuphathisana. What is that?
Right.
Ubuhlobo bethu. What is that?
Yeah.
Because I don't think there is a word for philanthropy in the Nguni languages I speak.
No, there
right?
isn't.
Just like there's no word for foreigner in the Nguni languages I speak. So then we have to stretch our head to find a word whose meaning is not relevant to us. So therefore, we're going to try and fit into that word, philanthropy. But what is it? Philanthropy is me and you sitting here and having a discussion as brothers about things that matter to us authentically and sincerely. And you could be doing something else with your time. So could I, but we're here.
But we're here.
And by design. Because we have a mutual desire to share ideas and to exchange. Right. So what do we call that? Maybe we should invent new words in our languages.
That's true.
Right. Maybe we should coin new words in our languages. But there is a need for us to almost walk away from the models of development and of growth that are framed in language that's not ours. Like I'm saying, this language of beneficiaries, this language of targets, indicators, this language of what is the
log frame,
all
those things,
because at the end of the day, what does that mean?
Can you put a person's life over 40 years?
But over 45 years, if you say to me, well, can we pull out this log frame or this M&E report that ORAP gave to a partner in 1992? What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Right? What does that mean?
I would be fascinated maybe at another time to really take a deep dive into the issue of language, because over the 45 years, definitely communities have been so central in determining the kind of language that ORAP is using and is intentional about, and what that means for the broader conversations on development. We have just been dealing with the word philanthropy on its own, and there are many others that we could look at. So at some point, I might want to find another time to have a chat.
But on that point, I think people like us, young Africans who care about the state of things, and B, who work in this space, whatever space you want to call it, but it's a space of development. Let's use that word broadly. We need to be very intentional around that question of language. Because one of the tensions that an organization like ORAP will have is, how do you translate what a development partner is saying at a community level, right? It's very hard. But it's easy to then go and say, we're going to dish out these things using this language, such that a community eventually stops thinking and they say, we are donors. But this is the workshop. Kumele sifile ama-feedback form. That becomes part of your language. It's my greater attendance register. Kusasa kumele ube the flip chart. And do it over 30 years and see what happens to the community.
And when that happens, the community forgets everything that matters to them.
So at ORAP we try and remember in our practice as practitioners ozethi bethu ozihluze ziqoqe zimisele zenzele, right? We try and remember our song. Lalela mngane impilo kamakhelwane nxa kunzima ncediseni, right? In that song it's saying, remember your neighbor's life. When it's difficult, let's help each other. Right? when we begin our meetings, we sing
Yeah,
our songs,
yeah,
we say our poems,
Yeah.
we say our philosophies,
Yeah.
so that we don't get drowned
Yeah.
in the language.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the language keeps moving.
Yeah.
What we call ilima, which is mali, used
Yeah.
to be called an internal savings and lending group. Then
Right.
it became a village savings
Yeah.
and lending.
Yeah.
Bagithi, kuze kube nini, because
Yeah.
tuthi ama-acronym.
Our acronyms, yes.
What's our language?
Yeah.
So I think you're right. We should have a forum on
Yeah,
language,
on language,
around our own
Yeah,
practice
yeah,
of self-development of Zenzele.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, and it's crucial. That's why even as ORAP, we don't throw away that
Yeah,
Zenzele.
yeah.
All our handles on social media say ORAP Zenzele. Our
Yeah.
website is ORAP Zenzele.
Zenzele, yeah.
Because once you remove that Zenzele,
Then you lose the essence.
then
and
you lose the
yeah.
essence, you lose the language.
So that song that you just sang, it just reminded me of, around 2008, 2009, when the crisis was really bad, food shortages. We'll be sending groceries to our parents and all of that.
Right.
And my cousin used to be so angry every time he goes home and finds that my mother has distributed
Right.
all the groceries that
Groceries.
would have sent. So one day he decides to really attend to her. Says, do you know how your son works like extra hours to send you these things and you are just distributing them around? And my mother says, so where does my son live? Says, well, he lives in Johannesburg. How far is that from Bulawayo? So this far. How long will it take him if I'm attacked here at night to get here?
Right. Right.
And that killed the argument.
Exactly.
Because immediately you realize that your neighbor is actually your security.
Exactly.
Your neighbor is everything.
That is community.
If my mother was not distributing whatever she received and shared with the neighbors, at any point when there's danger and she needs help, there's no one who's going to help her. So
Right.
it automatically it makes your neighbor security. It makes sharing and giving a form of security, but
Right.
also a form of making sure that as community you stay
Exactly.
good together.
And that's the safety net.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question. So from your studies around, for lack of a better word, this
Yeah.
question of philanthropy,
Yeah.
and this question of community development, and this question of collective contribution for
Yeah.
a better tomorrow,
Yeah.
what do you think an organization like ORAP should try and learn over the next 40 years?
Yeah.
If you were to sit 40 years from now and look back and you're talking to ORAP, you say, oh, maybe you should try and walk in this way.
Yeah.
What are you seeing that ORAP should also go and look for to learn and bring
Yeah.
back to
So,
community?
so I think for me to begin with, one will have to be very humble to accept that ORAP has been around for quite some time and it has developed mechanisms and approaches that have stood or withstood the test of time. So that's important. In fact, I was looking around here and realizing that these guys were they were not born when ORAP was
Right.
was established. I was probably like how old was I? If it's 45, I was 7 years old
Right.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it immediately tells you that there's something that you have gotten right over the years. So we need to look at that and maybe apply, a formula that I normally use, which is STARS. So STARS, S will stand for are you at a point where you require a startup mentality? So you look at everything that you are doing and see whether you require a startup mentality. And if you require a startup mentality, what does that mean in terms of resources, approaches, etc.? Or does it require turning around, which is the T? Again, you look at that and say, what is it that needs turning around? It may not be the entire institution, but some
Right.
elements of it.
Yeah.
Or all it needs is acceleration, which is the A. What do you accelerate? So there might be some things that you've been working on. You have the proof of concept. Now you need to accelerate and then accelerate. Or it might require restructuring, which is the R. So what are the elements that require restructuring? And then lastly, it may be that actually you have gotten it right. All you need to do is just to sustain. So I would do that exercise to look at it. But clearly, there are other things on the horizon that I think any institution will have to contend with. I mean, at some point we were talking about climate change, which actually links to your food security and nutrition program around that. But also it has implications for almost everything that you do. So I would look at that and see how using the tested methods of engagement with communities, you actually engage with that particular existential question. But there's also other issues that are emerging. conflicts, diversity issues that are just emerging almost left, right, and center. These conflicts could be your global wars, which have impact on us on food security and others, or they could just be community issues or conflicts that are as a result of climate change. So drought leads to conflict, and because of scarcity of resources and all of that. There's also issues of technology, where we're going. So I wouldn't sit here and try to say do this, especially to an institution that has proven the test of time. So that's my take on it at the moment. So I think there's a lot that you have done right, which from a distance everyone can look at and say, you know what, there's no way you could still be around if you have not remained true to particular principles that make you resilient. So you're a resilient organization, definitely. So that would be my take.
Also we come from resilient people. And that's the one thing that I think is remarkable about ORAP, is that it is made up of the people from the communities that it serves. It's not you know, it's not and it has no aspiration to become a multinational conglomerate, because if you're coming from people, you serve those people, and that helps in remembering why you exist.
Right. So another thing that I saw you also do a lot is enterprise development. Maybe you could speak to that and your program, your strategic pillar on food security and nutrition, because I think even though they are separate, all of these strategic pillars actually speak to each other.
They're very related. But I mean, ultimately, what is entrepreneurship? Zenzele. What does an entrepreneur do? He sees a problem, and a way to solve it, and in solving this problem, I will get a return. So it's rooted in the ORAP way. And with entrepreneurship is a catchphrase over the last 30 years. Then there's even social entrepreneurship and But ultimately, it's Zenzele. And if we teach ourselves what is Zenzele, we can then create solutions. Now, entrepreneurship in the business school sense is about income and expenditure and a product, market, deliver it. But that's not any different to our culture. Whether I'm doing a garden or goats or chickens or I'm really good at that's my service that I'm offering. I'm good at teaching. It's a training. So how do we inculcate the idea that Zenzele is not a foreign idea? Zenzele is what we do. And how do we move with this Zenzele concept in terms of the transitions that are happening economically? I don't think people really need to go to entrepreneurship school if they come from communities where you have to make a plan. And you've got to solve the problem. So we try and then focus on that as a strategic pillar, because it is inherent that communities need to create different forms of capital, including money. And how do you do that so that you can earn your own money to solve your own problems? And I mean, then we can get into macroeconomics and so on and so forth. But at the micro level, every household, why entrepreneurship became a pillar, because ORAP works at a household level. Every household should see itself as an enterprise. And members of that family is part of an enterprise. And how do we create the language again around that, the practice around it, the systems? If you're farming, how do you do farming as an enterprise? If you're constructing, how does that become an enterprise? So it's to really bring everything back to the household. But it's not new. It's the world over. Every household is an enterprise. We can't just see ourselves as sources of labor.
So, I mean, emerging or coming out of ORAP is the community foundation of the greater region of Zimbabwe, which also on its own has actually become a reference point for community foundations, which is a movement that started in the US. But of course, people did not make the linkages between what was happening in the US and what was happening also with institutions like the foundation that you established here. And so whenever people were thinking of community foundations, they were thinking of those institutions that were established in the US, until such a point that everyone said, wait a minute, there are these foundations like the Community Foundation of the Greater Region of Zimbabwe and others. Maybe let's talk a bit about the foundation in terms of why, what gap it was filling at that moment and now, and potentially also maybe where you see it going in future.
Yeah, I mean the foundation is also born out of a value that ORAP as an organization has, but communities also have called Kokelela. Good Kokelela is to contribute. I don't know if there's a direct translation for Kokelela in English. The idea was back to where we started our discussion. Each one of us has something to give.
Right.
And if we give enough, we can create our own endowment, which can then collectively give to things that we prioritize as important. So that was the idea of the foundation. First of all, is we have a place where our giving can be endowed, can be deposited. But secondly, it allows people to engage with others with dignity. So we're not, if you're bringing $100,000, you're not bringing your $100,000 to $0. And that is Kokele, even if it's $10.
Yes.
But we have a foundation in the true sense of the word, right? So it allows people to say, no, let's meet each other and talk. And we've also expressed our contribution in the same language of yours, which is dollars and cents. So the foundation really, it's an umbrella, it's a shade that people can stand under and say, when it's hot, we have shade. When it's raining, we have shade. But if you are bringing something to us, we're doing it together. And then automatically you remove that philanthropy, beneficiary, giver, donor, recipient discussion, because now we're partnering. Without a foundation, without an endowment, without your own contribution, I can dictate. But if we're partnering, because as a community you've put something together, it's a very different dynamic.
It is.
And so the idea of the foundation was to allow people to come together to say, we are going to put a piece of our lives into something that we trust, something that reflects us, something that encompasses us, and then on our behalf, this foundation can negotiate and can mobilize for what we also as communities have determined to be of importance.
You just used something very fundamental and deep, which is umthunzi, a shed. So if you think about that, it means that, umthunzi is a result of, you planting something and allowing it to grow.
Correct.
But you are not assured that you will sit
under that shade.
That shade. And that's something beautiful.
That's the essence of philanthropy. You're not doing it for yourself.
That's something beautiful. So when communities are doing that, the expectation is not that I am the one who's going to sit under that. No, it's really like, I'm not sure somebody else will sit under that shade. Beautiful to me. So I want us to end on one of the associations that you have had. Obviously you have had so many partners. I was actually looking at the many groups that you work with, but one of them is the work that you came together with Trust Africa and Kufunda, which is Gateway Zimbabwe. So maybe you can talk to us briefly around your participation and what you sought to achieve. We spoke to Kufunda the other day, and they were showing us the map that you guys were looking and working on. Fascinating stuff. And I was even saying to Jackie, if we have some time, we would actually need something written up for that process so that it can be shared. Because I'm sure many communities elsewhere other than just in Zimbabwe would want to see that systematic way of looking at things and how to respond.
Of the things that we've done as ORAP, that is one of the most impactful collaborations we've had. Because in its essence, it wasn't transactional. It wasn't about a grant being made to deliver these things. It was three organizations coming together, Trust Africa, Kufunda, and ORAP, to say, how do we begin to create a collective national response to some of the burning questions Zimbabwe is facing over time? And how do we do it with a generative process? And how do we involve communities? And how do we create pathways or maps that we might not even be there to walk in terms of those pathways? And how do we make sure it's rooted in dialogue and in listening, and not just in acting and So in 2017, when we started this work, we couldn't have imagined that it would have brought so many people together. We've organized citizen conventions in partnership with Trust Africa and ZimAlliance and Kufunda. We've organized trainings. We've organized building the capacity in communities to hold spaces for very difficult conversations and conflict and inquiry.
Yeah.
And I think being able to harvest a collection of stories that are otherwise not told, because in Africa we're so used to being convened by others. This is a convention on an ongoing basis driven by Africans. So I think that worked for me in such an inspiration, because it's enabled and allowed me to sit with people who are giving of their time and of their stories and of their lives, which is what philanthropy is about. And discovering that there's organizations like Trust Africa and co-founder with Mayan and Jackie and others who are committed to staying in the space of convening dialogue and of allowing processes like what the collaboration is allowed to happen to give answers to burning questions.
Dumi, thank you so much for taking your time.
No, thank you, man.
I mean, I can tell that we just scratched the surface. There's a lot. If I'm to speak to the founder, speak to everyone who's also been involved, I mean, the picture will emerge even much broader. So thank you for making the time to talking to us.
For coming out this way.
Yeah, thank you so much. So that was Dumisani Nyoni, who is the senior advisor at ORAP, responsible for strategy and business development. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.